without further ado, let's get into my 2024 NFL early predictions and best bets. There's no better place to start than the AFC East. And as you guys know, last year I was not high on this team. I thought there was too much hype going into the season. I thought their offensive line was a mess. I thought the division was better. I did not think the acquisition of a certain quarterback was going to make the difference for this team, who many people said was a Super Bowl contender. But then obviously he got hurt 4 snaps into the season, and their season went into the tank. But this year, I think Buffalo takes a step down with their losses. I think Miami takes a step down with their losses. I think New England is still in a rebuild. And if Aaron Rodgers stays healthy, ladies and gentlemen, at 11-6, I have the New York Jets winning the AFC East. Now their over/under total is at 9.5. Again, if something happens to Rodgers or the offensive line, this very well could be a 9-win team. You could take the under. Obviously, I'm taking the over here by 2 games at 11-6. I do love the addition of Mike Williams to Kyle Garrett Wilson. Now, they did lose CJ Uzama as a tight end. They still need to replace that spot. But when I look at the Jets, they redid their offensive line. Obviously, their first round pick. They also brought in Tyron Smith from Dallas. They brought in a couple offensive linemen from the Baltimore Ravens, including Morgan Moses, who was with the Jets, and Robert Saleh's rookie year to play right tackle. We know how good that defense is. And, they won 6, 7 games the last 2 years with Zach Wilson and Trevor Siemian and whoever else at quarterback the Jets would have. Their backup is also Tyrod Taylor, who we know is a competent backup who can win games. Nathaniel Hackett is back as OC, but essentially, we are going to see this Jets team, who they also drafted a slot receiver in the draft, who I like. I think with Breece Hall as your primary running back now, with Aaron Rodgers running the show, it is maybe, next to Chicago or Atlanta, the biggest quarterback upgrade in the league. And again, with the Dolphins' defensive losses, and top of that, with the Bills' defensive losses, I think the New York Jets, if they're going to win the AFC East finally for the first time since the 2000s, this is the year they do it. Now, Miami, their over-unders at 9.5. I have them at 9-8, and you'll see this a lot with a lot of the over-unders here that I have them, a game or so over or under, depending on where the projection is, which is why I do feel like, in recent years, this is my best that I've done at projecting out teams' win-loss records in May. And a reminder for you that these are not official. These are my best guesses as we get into training camp, as we see which rookies are going to start, as we see which moves are made, injuries, etc. A lot of these teams over-unders are going to, move a half a game or a game, if you will. But I have Miami at 9-8. Again, I'm concerned because they pretty much lost their entire secondary. New defensive coordinator Vic Fangio is now gone. He is the new defensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles. And I do worry about Miami's schedule, where they have to go to Buffalo later in the year. They have to go to Cleveland later in the year. That week 17 Sunday night football game against Cleveland is a scheduling loss for Miami. It's a scheduling win for Cleveland because we know Tua and the Dolphins are essentially the speedboat of the NFL. They're going to get off to a fast start. Then the weather's going to get cold in November, December. We're going to see if they can play for real. And again, I question the Dolphins down the stretch. I think they have a very explosive offense, but I question what they can do. And I do think Tua is going to have a good year. I don't think he's going to have a great year statistically. At third place, now Buffalo's over-unders at 10.5, and this is going to be one of my best bets. I am betting the under on the Buffalo Bills, which is 10.5. I don't see the way this Bills team gets to 11 wins this year in this division. Again, unless the Jets completely fall off the face of the earth and there's a ton of injuries. But Buffalo, Tre'Davious White is now gone. Jordan Poyer is now gone. Micah Hyde is now gone. We know Stephon Diggs is now gone. And even though Joe Brady came in last year midseason and simplified the offense, and James Cook got more involved, and they really ran through the two tight ends, which they still have, and Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid, I think Buffalo is going to be one of these teams where they have a defensive coach in Sean McDermott. Again, we know Miami has an offensive coach in Mike McDaniel. Now, the Jets have a defensive coach in Robert Saleh, but essentially, Nathaniel Hackett, Aaron Rodgers are going to run that offense. And I don't think Buffalo's defense is going to be as good as what it was a year ago. And I think the Bills are going to be very Josh Allen reliant. And that scares me. And as great as Josh Allen is, and usually when it comes to these picks, I'm going to pick the best quarterback in the division. I think this year, stats wise at least, Aaron Rodgers could be the best quarterback in that division. So I think the Bills take a step back. Unless one of these two receivers they drafted hit, could they get to 10? I think so, but I don't think they're going to be as explosive. It could help them, come December, January, when you can run the football. But I think a little bit earlier in the season, Buffalo may struggle coming right out of the gates. I think that Arizona week 1 game is a tricky game for Buffalo. Could be a loss there. Then they go to Miami, and even though they played well against the Dolphins at the September game in Florida, that's not easy. I could see Buffalo starting off 0-2, and the wheels maybe start to spin and question about Sean McDermott's job security. Now, New England, their over-unders at 4.5, and I have them at 2-15. So clearly, I am taking the under. But I will say this. I'm not going to put this as a part of my best bets because we never know. Drake May could pop. But as I said, out of the 6 first-round quarterbacks that were drafted this year, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, Michael Penix, J.J. McCarthy, Bo Nix, I think unquestionably the guy in the worst situation here is Drake May. I know they have a new head coach in Gerard Mayo. The Bill Belichick era is over. New England went almost exclusively to the offensive side of the ball in the draft. And if Drake May hits without really any weapons, could this be the surprise team in the NFL this year? Sure. I think if they were in the NFC, they may be more of a 5-6 win team. But in your own division, you got to deal with Buffalo, Miami, and the Jets. You may win 1 at the most 2 games in your own division. Then you got to deal with, outside forces that you're in your own conference schedule. You're playing the likes of the Houston Texans, the Indianapolis Colts, who I think will be improved. Jacksonville is still a very good football team, and then Tennessee, I think you could beat. But in your own conference, when you have the Chiefs, the Chargers, I think will be better. Denver, who was no pushover. We saw Vegas win, 7, 8 games last year without a quarterback. Obviously, the entire AFC North. I think all those factors are going against New England, and why I have them potentially finishing with the #1 overall pick. Even if Jacoby Brissett does start most of the season and Drake May doesn't see the field, I think New England is just in a tough place in the conference where they're not going to win a ton of games. So as a reminder, in the AFC East, I have Jets 11-6, Miami 9-8, Buffalo 9-8, New England 2-15. I'm best betting Buffalo under 10.5. Moving to the AFC West, I have the Chiefs winning the division at 12-5. I think the Chiefs have a great chance, more than potentially any other team in the history of the NFL. And we've seen dynasties from the Steelers in the 70s, the Niners and Cowboys in the 90s, to New England in the 2000s, the 2010s, to Kansas City's in the 2020s. I think Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, the kid Worthy they drafted out of Texas with their first-round pick, will probably end up replacing Rashid Rice, who has dealt with a lot of offseason drama, obviously. But this Andy Reid team is fun. They're not going to get full of themselves. They know they're going to get everybody's best shot. And while it's hard for a team to repeat, obviously, in the National Football League, nobody has ever done it. I think if there's one team to do it, it may be this Chiefs team. They're over-unders at 11.5. Again, I have them at 12, so just barely taking the over. In second place, though, a game behind them, and this is going to be one of my best bets again. The over-under on the Chargers is 8.5, and I say that they easily win 9 games this year. Take the over. Their schedule, they start off at home against the Raiders and on the road against Carolina. They also have on the road against Pittsburgh, which is a winnable game as well in week 3. The NFL wants Jim Harbaugh and the Los Angeles Chargers to get off to a great start. And with the tackle, they took Joe Alt out of Notre Dame with the 5th overall pick. They ended up not trading out of that pick. The Chargers now have obviously Rashawn Slater at left tackle, Joe Alt at right tackle. That is a huge offensive line advantage. And yes, they did lose Austin Eckler. They did lose Mike Williams. They did lose Keenan Allen. But a Jim Harbaugh / Greg Roman led offense is going to be ground and pound. And they brought in both running backs from the Baltimore Ravens, Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, to be that ground and pound offense. And I think when you take on a team like Denver, who doesn't have a great line, a team like Vegas, who even though they did bring in Christian Wilkins to go alongside Max Crosby, their defense is not great. And when you play a team like Kansas City, who, as we know, outside of Chris Jones, right, their defensive line is not the best. You want to try to play keep away. Justin Herbert, I don't think he's going to have the best stats in the world, but I think he's going to have a very good year. They drafted some wide receivers, which we all know in the NFL, you can get wide receivers in any round. Just take a look at Puka Nacua last year. I think the Chargers team is going to be better than a lot of people think. I have them as an easy walk-in playoff team at 11-6, second in the AFC West. I'm also going to best bet Denver because their over under is 5.5, and I don't see a world where they lose, 5 or when they win 5 or less games. So I'm taking the over. I had them at 7-10, and they went 8-9 last year with a disastrous Russell Wilson, Jared Stidham situation. Now they have Bo Nix, who I assume is going to start week 1, and I think he will start the whole season. And Denver has, a pretty particular early good home schedule. And we all know that out there in the altitude in Denver at Mile High, it's a very hard place to play. And even though they don't have Jerry Jeudy anymore, you're going to tell me that the likes of Javonte Williams, Cortland Sutton, their offensive line, Sean Payton essentially rebuilt it in a year. You still have Justin Simmons and Patrick Surtain in that secondary. I don't think Denver is necessarily going to be a pushover. I think last year it took a little bit for Russell Wilson to get going. It will probably be the same for Bo Nix to get going. But I'm not going to say he's going to have a Jordan Love-esque breakout at the end of the year. But I think Bo Nix will be better later than he is early. He does have some Sean Payton qualities. And again, I thought he could play at Oregon. I thought he could play at Auburn. The fact that he has 60 college starts, I know it had some concerns for some of my guests that I brought on here in the offseason, reminded them somewhat of Kenny Pickett. But I think Bo Nix may be a stronger armed Kenny Pickett. And in that system where it's all rhythm and timing, short passes, get the ball out, I think Bo Nix will have success. So I have Denver at 7-10. So that means in 4th place, they're over under 6.5. I'm going to go one down on it. I have Vegas at 6-11. Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell are essentially in a quarterback battle to see who's going to get that job. No matter what, that's going to be the worst quarterback in the division, which historically will not do you well. I like Antonio Pierce as head coach. I talked about this a lot with the Raiders. Hunter Renfrow, Jacoby Myers, Devontae Adams, Michael Mayer, Brock Bowers. That is weapons galore for the Las Vegas Raiders. They bring in Christian Wilkins over from the Miami Dolphins to go alongside Tyree Wilson, Max Crosby. That's a very good defensive line. They did lose Josh Jacobs in the run game, and they don't have a quarterback, which is the only reason, in my opinion, why this Raiders team is going 6-11. If this Raiders team had a Jaden Daniels, or they, God forbid, even had a Kirk Cousins or a Bo Nix or Michael Penix or whoever, I would have this Vegas team above Denver, and I would consider them a playoff team. I think Brock Bowers is going to be one of the best tight ends that we've seen in the NFL this side of Rob Gronkowski. Again, you have Devontae Adams, you have all the weapons. My concern is quarterback and offensive line. They both need to rebuild, and I think that's why Vegas is going to be winning games because of the weapons they have, but they're not an overall great talented team. They have the pieces. They just need to put the right piece at the single caller position. So let's go to the AFC North, where I basically have a tie for first place. I have Baltimore with a better division record of 4-2 than Cincinnati at 3-3 because I think Baltimore will probably sweep Cleveland because the Browns struggle with Lamar Jackson. But I have both the Ravens and Bengals at 11-6. Baltimore's over under is 11.5. Cincinnati's over under is 10.5. So again, one down on Baltimore, one up on Cincinnati. I could very well see the Cincinnati Bengals, for the record, winning this division with either 12 wins or even, 11, and Baltimore gets 10. I think Joe Burrow, people are forgetting that this Bengals team won 9 games last year, and Joe Burrow was either not healthy or missed most of the season. This is assuming, by the way, that E. Higgins is back. They also drafted the wide receiver out of Alabama in the third round, who's going to replace Tyler Boyd, who went with now head coach of the Tennessee Titans, Brian Callahan. So they did lose him as OC, though he wasn't the primary play caller. That is head coach Zach Taylor. So it's not going to be that much of a burden as it was for other teams who maybe their OC was also their play caller. They did lose Joe Mixon, but they did not use him a lot, specifically last year. They upgraded their offensive line. And again, as long as you have Joe Burrow there, I like what the Cincinnati Bengals have done. Baltimore, as we mentioned, they did lose some pieces at the running back position. They lost Odell Beckham to Miami to add another speed threat to the Miami Dolphins offense. But this division is all about Lamar Jackson. And as long as Lamar Jackson's there, they're going to have a new defensive coordinator as well. Mike McDonald obviously goes from Baltimore to Seattle, but the Ravens seem to find defensive coordinators overnight. The Ravens are such a well run organization. They may be the most well run organization in football. For that reason, I think the lowest you got to put them in the win total is 10. John Harbaugh, can't wait to see his battle with Jim this year as the Harbaugh brothers battle it out again. Both two of the best coaches in all of the National Football League. Now, this one surprised me. So the Steelers, their over under is at 7.5. I was considering making this one of my best bets. As a reminder, so far we have Buffalo with the under at 10.5. We have the Chargers with the over at 8.5, and we have Denver with the over at 5.5. Because we have 3 teams already in the AFC, again, this is one that I would consider. But the Steelers back out of the schedule, we mentioned their last 8 games. Not only do they have all 6 division games, so 2 with Cincinnati, 2 with Pittsburgh, or excuse me, 2 with Baltimore and 2 with Cleveland, which they'll probably split. You would say they probably win their home games, lose their road games, especially in a very tough division. That's generally the general rule, unless you have a very bad team. So I got them going 3-3 there. And then they host Kansas City. I don't think they can keep up with the Chiefs offense. And then they go to Philly. And we saw the last time they go to Philly, and historically, when they go to Philly, they don't perform very well at all. So that could be a 3-5 finish there for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I add them at 9-8. So, a 6-3 start to a 3-5 finish feels very, Steeler-esque brand. Mike Tomlin cares very much about that winning record. They have teams like the Jets in there. But they also got to go up against the AFC West early in the year. So they got to go to Denver. I think that's a bad scheduling break. They got the Chargers at home, but they got to go to Vegas. That's a tough place to play, going from East to West Coast. So they also have Dallas early in the year, which at home they'll probably win. They have the Giants. They got to go to Philly, and then they got Washington, which is again a toss-up game in my opinion. So with the addition of Russell Wilson, and now you got Justin Fields. And by the way, their first game, Arthur Smith, their new offensive coordinator, goes back to Atlanta. That's an interesting plot development right there. So it's a strange schedule for Pittsburgh. I think Russell Wilson is an upgrade over Kenny Pickett, not much. I don't see Justin Fields getting on the field unless Russell Wilson gets hurt because of the fact I think the Steelers would rather give a 6th round pick to Chicago for the Justin Fields trade as opposed to a fourth round pick. We know their defense is always good. We know Mike Tomlin is always well coached. I did not like the trading away of Deontay Johnson. Now they still got George Pickens. They brought in Quez Watkins over from the Philadelphia Eagles. That could give some speed to the offense. But they have two good backs, Najee Harris, Jalen Warren. We know how Arthur Smith loves to use his backs. I expect him to do so with both. And this could very well be the year based off the schedule. The Steelers no longer have a winning record, but until they do so, I'm not betting on it. I got them at 9-8. And then we got the Browns, who last year they obviously made the playoffs. And Joe Flacco went on a miracle run towards the end of the year, and then they got bounced in the wild card round, handed away by the Houston Texans. Andrew Berry, without very many draft choices, I thought went out and addressed not only the defensive line, the defensive tackles position specifically, but also depth on that offensive line. They traded for Jerry Jeudy from Denver to what they hope will be to give a complement number 2 wide receiver, the opposite of Amari Cooper, who's been very good and better than I would suspect in a Browns uniform when he got traded there a few years ago. But this season for the Browns, all hails on Deshaun Watson. And a lot like we're going to talk about when we get to the NFC North. I think the Browns, no matter what, will always be third in the quarterback conversation in the division. When you got, Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow ahead of you. A lot like Denver and Vegas, where you got Herbert and Mahomes ahead of you, you're going to be third and fourth in that division. Miami too is very good, but if Rodgers is healthy, you're behind Josh Allen and Aaron Rodgers in that division. So the AFC is just brutal. And Evan Stefanski to me, he got away with facing some early teams. He's not the best in-game strategy management coach. And the Browns have the hardest and toughest schedule in the National Football League this year. They have a murderer's row of home games on their schedule, which include the likes of the Chargers, the Chiefs, obviously all three divisional opponents. And then you also have, a team like Jacksonville, where they got to go to Jacksonville early in the year, down in that Jacksonville heat. Don't love that. They have Miami at home to end the year, which I do think, again, is a scheduling break. But they got a lot of division games late in the year, too. They play Pittsburgh 2 times in 3 weeks. They play Baltimore, week 18, which could be potentially for the AFC North division for Baltimore's standpoint. So I don't love the outlook on the Browns. I think Deshaun Watson will have an okay year, not a great year. I have the Browns. Sorry for my Cleveland faithful. Their over-under is 8.5. I have them at 7-10. Now we get to the AFC South, where I have the winner of the division being the Houston Texans at 11-6. Now their over-under is 9.5. And I'll say this, to be honest with you, out of all the division winners that I picked, which again is the Jets, Kansas City, I basically have Baltimore and Cincinnati right now tied for the division. I would lean towards Baltimore just because of that head-to-head division tiebreaker, but I think Cincinnati can very much win it. And Houston, the one I'm least confident about winning the division is actually the Texans. Because I think the Jaguars, even without Calvin Ridley, we saw they drafted some wide receivers in the draft. I think their offense was too Calvin Ridley focused. I think they actually did better when they add just Kirk, Ingram, Zay Jones, and those bodies for Lawrence to throw to. The way the Jags ended the season last year, I think they have a bounce back year. Anthony Richardson didn't play at all for the Colts, and it went down to the final game of the season. I think the Colts are going to have Anthony Richardson finally complete a game, and I think they're going to compete for a playoff spot this year. So even with the additions of Stephon Diggs, which I love, with the addition of Joe Mixon in the running game, which is an upgrade over Devin Singletary, with D'Amico Ryans as a defensive head coach, we'll see if Bobby Slowick can be that all-star offensive coordinator that he was again last year. But CJ Stroud was so impressive as a rookie, you almost have to see him duplicate it again, or there is going to be natural regression for the Houston Texans. Again, I think the two biggest additions on the offense side of the ball of Mixon and Diggs will help. And Stroud could have an MVP level year. And there's some people in the media that think they could compete with Kansas City for the top of the AFC. I think their division is better than people think. This is no longer the cakewalk that is the AFC South that it was, when Deshaun Watson was leading the division for the Houston Texans. But this team, talent wise, is the most talented team in the division. Now, number two, I actually have the Indianapolis Colts. As I mentioned, I am big on the Colts. Their offensive line last year was healthy. If they stay healthy again, they have one of the best offensive lines in the game. They still got DeForest Buckner at defensive tackle. They have Michael Pittman at wide receiver, who's their big weapon. But again, the biggest story for this team is Anthony Richardson, who last year, this team basically won 8 games with Gardner Minshew at the quarterback position. They have an all-star head coach and OC in Shane Steichen, who's one of the most wizardry offensive coordinators slash play callers in the sport. That is part of the optimism for the Indianapolis Colts. And then Trevor Lawrence, who I think, has been a little bit disappointing so far in his Jacksonville career. Year two looked on the up with Doug Peterson, and then he got hurt last year, and obviously the whole team fell apart. I think defensively, they brought over the old Atlanta DC to be their DC. They did not make a ton of moves. They need to get better in the secondary. They need to get, short the offensive line a little bit more. But for Jacksonville, this is basically a Trevor Lawrence-led team. I think ETN's going to have a good year. I think they have a decent amount of weapons. I think they're a team that you can't sleep on. I think they're going to win games. Their over-under is 8.5. And I think them in Indianapolis are virtually the same team. Good weapons, good back, very good quarterback, even though I think Richardson's more mobile than Lawrence. I think Lawrence is the better player. I think Indianapolis has the better defense. For that reason, I have the Colts going 9-8. Their over under is 8.5. I have Jacksonville going 8-9. Their over under is 8.5. I have Jacksonville taking just the under at 8. Now, the last team in the AFC, who I think will be the second worst team in the conference, that is the Tennessee Titans. Boy, do they have weapons galore. This is very similar, in my opinion, potentially to a team that we get to talk about as a team that's on the up and up, that's coming, like the Las Vegas Raiders. But this team doesn't have a quarterback, right? It's Will Levis. So even though they have a new head coach in Brian Callahan, and Bill Callahan, his father, the historic offensive line coach, which I think, by the way, I didn't mention it, that's a big loss for Cleveland. I don't trust Will Levis. And they did nothing to replace Derrick Henry, who I almost forgot is the back that Baltimore replaced J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards with. Did not mention that. But again, I think them and the Bengals are right there in the AFC North. When you look at Tennessee, DeAndre Hopkins is still there. Tyler Boyd comes over from Cincinnati. Calvin Ridley got a bag to go from Jacksonville. It sounded like New England was interested in him. He goes from Jacksonville to Tennessee. But their defense is atrocious. Kevin Byard obviously is no longer there. Outside of Jeffrey Simmons, I can't name for you one player on that defense. This to me is a complete rebuild. They're going to try to give Will Levis 1 year, and this to me reminds me a lot of what Washington did with Sam Howell a year ago, where it's like, hey, we like our weapons. We're going to give Sam Howell 1 year to try himself out, and it just did not work. So I have Tennessee. They're over under 6.5. That's about right to me. They could win, 6 or 7 games. I have them slotted in, though, for now at 5-12. So to recap the AFC right now, my division winners: Kansas City, Jets, Houston, Baltimore. I think for sure 2 wildcard teams are going to be Cincinnati or Baltimore, whoever doesn't win the division, as well as the Chargers. So now you got one spot. And for me, you got teams like Miami at 9-8, Buffalo at 9-8, Pittsburgh at 9-8, Indianapolis 9-8, and then Jacksonville at 8-9. Those 5 teams will be fighting for one spot. And according to all the division tiebreakers, conference record, etc., right now Pittsburgh would be slotted into that spot. though I would actually lean Miami here. And I do think that historically in the NFL, we have six new playoff teams every single year. I think there's going to be three potentially from the AFC, three potentially from the NFC at least. And so my new playoff teams in the AFC are Jets, Chargers, Bengals. I think that's a lot. And I think, again, Kansas City, Houston, and a Miami will probably be your three from last year that stay in the thick of things, along with Baltimore. So Kansas City, Baltimore, Houston, Miami, I think will be the four from last year that stay in the playoffs. I think Jets, Bengals, Chargers are your three bets to essentially replace Buffalo in the Jet Zone division, Pittsburgh, which Cincinnati would replace in their own division, and then the Chargers replace Cleveland as that final playoff spot. So now that we get to the NFC, which again, in the AFC, for my best bets, we got Buffalo under 10.5, Chargers over 8.5, Denver over 5.5. The others I would consider would be New England under 4.5, Pittsburgh over 7.5, and then Tennessee under 6.5, because I don't think there's a way they get to 7. But again, we'll have to see depending on injuries, offseason changes, etc. Now we get to the NFC. We're starting it off in the NFC East, where the Philadelphia Eagles, who collapsed obviously at the end of last season. However, Coach Pencil is no longer calling the defense. Brian Johnson is no longer calling the offense. It is Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio as the two coordinators, respectively. They brought in Saquon Barkley, and they brought in two new defensive backs who probably could start for this team right away, and Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. I think the Eagles are out for a bounce back, if you could call it that, revenge year, and their over-unders at 10.5, and I could see them being a 10-7, 11-5, or 11-6, excuse me. But this may be homerism and maybe optimism to you. I have my Eagles 12-5 winning the NFC East. Now, Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys, right? They were all in this year, and their over under is 10.5. It's the same as the Eagles. I had them barely the under at 10 wins. They did nothing this offseason. They think they upgraded their offensive and defensive lines in the draft. We'll see. But their running back situation, they let Tony Pollard go to Tennessee, who, by the way, is another weapon for Will Levis to play with. But the bottom line is, outside of CeeDee Lamb, and maybe you can make an argument, Jarwin, the tight end, potentially, this is a Dak Prescott pop gun offense. And now they have a new defensive coordinator, Mike Zimmer, who's a good defensive coordinator, not great. I think Dan Quinn's scheme will be better for Dallas. I think it will be time for Mike Zimmer to sort of take its time and get into that system. It could be a slow start for Dallas. I think that Cleveland game, week 1, trap game early. You got to go to Pittsburgh on a Sunday night. You got to play Baltimore early in the season. You got to go to San Francisco in the first part of the season. That's rough for Dallas. Now, I think the second half, they bounce back nice. They'll probably split with the Commanders, who I see as an up-and-coming team. They'll definitely sweep the Giants, who I think will be the worst team in the NFC. But I think that this Cowboys schedule, the back half of it, is the reason why they get to 10 wins. But if there's a CeeDee Lamb injury here, and by the way, there's a Week 17 game in Philadelphia that could decide the division between Dallas and Philly, I think they're a CeeDee Lamb injury away from being a bad offense. And I think that this Dallas team, they're going to win games. They're not going to be special. They're not going to be overly dynamic. And this could be Mike McCarthy's last year in a Dallas Cowboy uniform coaching the team. Now, the Commanders. This is one I considered as a best bet because they're over under 6.5, and I'm way higher on them than most people. I have the Commanders at 9-8. I think with their offseason additions, and I love their draft outside of Jaden Daniels, getting the defensive tackle out of Illinois, getting the brother of Christian McCaffrey. I think the things that they have done to set up Jane Daniels, Tyler Bionis, the free agent center, comes over from Dallas. So I think Jane Daniels and his mobility now with new offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury is going to be an air it out system. You got Austin Eckler now, who's going to catch a lot of passes out of the backfield at that running back position. I just don't know. Again, you still got Jonathan Allen and Deron Payne there, but they did lose, obviously, Montez Sweat last year to the Bears in that trade. They traded away Chase Young to San Francisco. Am I too high on the Commanders? That is my question right now with them. And so that's the only reason why I'm a little hesitant. Because if Jane Daniels is worse than I thought, they're going to be a 6-7 win team. But if he hits, like I think he could, this is a 9-10 win team. I'll go 9 on the conservative side. But I think they can definitely push Dallas for the wild card crown there in the NFC East. And then the Giants, who they did draft Malik Neighbors, obviously at the top of the draft. You guys know I wasn't the biggest fan of Malik Neighbors. I like Roma Dunze better than him. And to be honest with you, I don't really care. Daniel Jones or Drew Lock is going to be their quarterback. And it's going to be Malik Neighbors or bust because they don't have any more wide receivers. And Saquon Barkley is now a member of the Philadelphia Eagles. Devin Singletary, the running back position, doesn't put any scare into you. Now, they did pick up Brian Burns from the Carolina Panthers. So you do have Dexter Lawrence, you do have Kayvon Thibodeau, and you do have Burns on that defensive line. A lot like the Commanders last year, where again they only won a few games. And they mostly won it because their defense is probably going to be pretty good, especially up front. But when you don't have any weapons and when you don't have a quarterback, it's going to be a long season for you. Now, the difference between the two teams may be obviously that Brian Dable's an offensive coach, Ron Rivera was a defensive coach. But I think this Giants team needs a complete reset. They should have drafted a quarterback this year, whether it was JJ McCarthy or Drake May. They decided not to, and they're essentially going to pay Daniel Jones another $40 million to sit on the bench and maybe watch Drew Lock play football. I don't think that's a recipe for success. So I have the Giants, who I know have an off-season edition of Hard Knocks coming. I'm not excited for it at all because I think this team's a disaster. Take the under. There's no way they get to 7 wins. They're over under 6.5. They're not going to get to 7. This may be the best bet out of all of them this season. Giants, 3-14. Bottom sellers in the NFC East, bottom sellers in the NFC. Now let's get to the NFC West. San Francisco's over under is 11.5. You know there's not a lot to say about the San Francisco. I had them at 12-5. Bottom line is it is Super Bowl or bust for Brock Purdy and crew. There's been drama surrounding Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel. It does feel like in a year or so when they have to pay Brock Purdy, this is the Niners' last chance to get to the big dance. We will find out if they can do so. Second place, I have the Los Angeles Rams, so I'm not as high on them as some people are. Some people think the Rams could make the NFC Championship game this year. Now, their over-under is 8.5. I have them at 9, so barely above the threshold line there. I think the loss of Aaron Donald, even though I said there's some big games that I watch Aaron Donald, just like that wild card game last year against the Detroit Lions, and I did not see special. I did not see game changing too many times from Aaron Donald when he disappears from games. But the bottom line is, if Matthew Stafford's healthy, if Cooper Kupp is healthy, if Puka Nacua is healthy, the Rams are going to win games. Now, their defense, again, they lose Raheem Morris, who I thought did a great job with that unit. He's now the head coach in Atlanta. It's going to take some time. Now, they did drop those 2 kids out of UCLA back to back. They are hoping that a year, in development, their defense rises and shines. But also, to me, you cannot trust Matthew Stafford to have back-to-back healthy seasons. I think Stafford will show signs of age towards the end of this year. That's why the rumor was out about the Rams potentially moving up to get a Michael Penix or a JJ McCarthy or a Drake May in this draft because they don't even trust the health of Matthew Stafford. Now, number 3, I have Arizona. Now, their over-under is at 6.5. I have them just under at 6-11. I don't think they're going to be a pushover. And what we saw late last year, and I saw it up close and personal, week 17 in Philadelphia, when Kyler Murray's healthy, and this team, again, even without weapons, they lost Hollywood Brown, who's now in Kansas City, by the way, another speedster for Andy Reid and the Chiefs to use. This team won games at the end of last year. And I don't think Kyler Murray, and Kyler doesn't seem to be too focused on Call of Duty, and he doesn't seem to be immature. He seems to have grown up ever since suffering that ACL injury now about 18 months ago. Like, I think Arizona is going to be a feisty 6-win team. Jonathan Gannon had those guys playing at the end of last year. They're going to be fun to watch. And don't forget about all the draft picks they made, and maybe the biggest one, number 4 overall, Marvin Harrison Jr. And as I've said, we've seen guys like Josh Allen go from not having a lot of weapons to having Stephon Diggs, instant pop. We saw with Jalen Hurts not have a ton of weapons outside of Devontae Smith. You get an A.J. Brown, instant pop. We saw Kyler Murray do this when Arizona went out and acquired DeAndre Hopkins when he was still in his prime. It could be the case here with Marvin Harrison, where it's an instant pop. The defense plays well, and Arizona goes from a 6-11 to an 8 or 9 win team in the weaker conference. So I think it's better this year than what it has been in years past in the NFC. Then we got Seattle, who they got weapons galore, but again, a lot like Vegas, a lot like Tennessee. I think Geno Smith, who had a miracle year 2 years ago, I think even with a new head coach in McDonald, I think they just keep going down, down, down. They brought in Sam Howell because it's going to be a bridge quarterback situation. But when you're in a division with Kyler Murray, with Matthew Stafford, and with Brock Purdy, who I don't love, but he's very serviceable with those weapons, I think it's clear who, a lot like the Cleveland Browns, have a very good roster, but you are the worst team at quarterback in your division. And for that reason, I think Seattle, who their defense, by the way, they lost both safeties, they need a complete rebuild. I think this is Geno Smith's last year in Seattle, who I think they will be a very aggressive next year to potentially move up and go get a Shador Sanders potentially. I think Seattle at 6-11 is fighting with Arizona in the basement in the NFC West. Sorry to a few Seahawks fans that I know listen to the Brands World podcast. Moving to the NFC North, which in my opinion has now overtaken the AFC North as the toughest division in the National Football League. Detroit's over-under is 10.5, which again does seem a little bit low for a division winner. But when you're in the division with 4 teams that I do believe absolutely could make the playoffs, I think it's about right. I'm barely taking the over on the Detroit Lions. I have them at 11-6. I think the biggest plus for the Detroit Lions this year was not only did they go out and they rebuilt their secondary in the draft, but Ben Johnson did not take a head coaching job. Aaron Glenn did not take a head coaching job. Not only that, but they are going to play 14 of their 17 games this year indoors or in warm weather. And we talked about this last year, maybe more so than other pundits out there in the media. Jared Goff and the Lions may be depending more on a dome or warm weather than any other team in the National Football League, because Jared Goff's numbers are left and right statistically different in warm climates versus cold. And they did just extend him, and there's obviously big expectations for the runner-up in the NFC. They got to get tougher if they're going to beat San Francisco, and I think they will get tougher because this division is a gauntlet. At number 2, at 10-7, their over-under is 8.5, and I'm telling you, I'm really flirting with taking the over on the Bears. But are me and Nick Wright from FS1 and maybe a few other people in the media, are we too high and thinking the Bears are going to take this big of a week? The way I look at it, the Bears won 7 games last year with Justin Fields. And Justin Fields, no matter what the numbers tell you, was not a very good quarterback. And Luke Getsy, who's now going to help out the quarterback in Las Vegas, by the way, is a good OC. I don't think he's very special. And the new OC in Seattle or in Chicago, Shane Waldron, fixed Geno Smith in Seattle. When he comes to that Sean McVay tree. And I think when you add Roma Dunce, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Swift to a core that already includes DJ Moore and Cole Kmet with an underrated offensive line, it was top 12 last year, according to Pro Football Focus, which is above average. I don't care what division you're in. This Bears offense is going to cook. Defense out of the ball. They were a top 10 unit last year. Once they acquired Montez Sweat at the trade deadline, they also had a very good safety in the back end with Kevin Byard. And we know Matt Eberflus, he may not be a great head coach, but he is a very good defensive coordinator and a defensive wizard. With that being said, Ryan Poles' job is on the line. Matt Eberflus' job is on the line. The Bears know they have to win. They know there's big pressure on them. But I thought outside of week 2, when they got to go to Houston on Sunday night, and obviously week 6, you got Jacksonville and London, there's not a lot of primetime game for the Bears. And just like the Pittsburgh Steelers, all 6 of their division games occur in the last 8 weeks. And Caleb Williams is going to get better as the year goes on. Advantage Chicago. Now, a lot like Baltimore and Cincinnati in the AFC North and the NFC North, I'm going to talk about 2 teams at the same time because I think they're essentially the same team. The Green Bay Packers, who I know Aaron Jones has been injured, but I did not love the fact that they replaced Aaron Jones with Josh Jacobs. I thought Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, who I thought very much regressed at the end of the season, I thought Aaron Jones was a perfect match for Green Bay. I thought he was a great running back in Matt LaFleur's system. I'm not sure Josh Jacobs wasn't a one-year wonder that they had 2 years ago in Vegas when he led the league in rushing. Josh Jacobs is a good back. To me, Aaron Jones is the better back. And Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, and the tight ends they have, Musgrave, etc., like they're nice weapons, but compared to Minnesota, compared to Chicago, compared to Detroit, I'm not sure Green Bay doesn't have the worst weapons in the division. You add on top of that, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, to me, are probably still better quarterbacks than Jordan Love, even though Jordan Love was very good at the end of last year. And we know in the NFL, progression is not linear, right? It's not like the NBA where you go from tanking to playing to first round to second round to conference to finals contender. You could go from Super Bowl contender to basement within the course of 6 months. And I'm not saying Green Bay is a bad team because they still have good piece on defense. DeAndre Campbell, Jair Alexander's still back there. They got a new defensive coordinator from Iowa State, I believe, or excuse me, Boston College, who's going to be taking over their play calling duties. But this division got better. Not only is Detroit going to be motivated, Chicago got better. I think the Minnesota Vikings, man. Listen, if I'm them, I start J.J. McCarthy week 1. I rip the Band-Aid off. I don't start Sam Darnold. And more than any other team, this Vikings team may be the team that I go back to and change their record based off what I hear about in preseason. Because I would feel different about this team, who's over under 7.5. I have them at 9-8. And I think I would feel different about this Minnesota team if I knew Sam Darnold was starting as opposed to J.J. McCarthy. But all I heard at Michigan was J.J. McCarthy's a winner. And I think Evan O'Connell is a rock star as a head coach. And I know their defense is bad, but Brian Flores is a very good defensive coordinator. And he's going to get the most out of not very guys that not a lot of people know. And when you have Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, Aaron Jones, when you have Christian Darrisaw at left tackle, I don't see a way a young quarterback can fail unless he can't make it in the NFL. So this, to me, is the ultimate test for the Minnesota Vikings, who I think people are sleeping on. I would bet the over if there wasn't one other under that I love more, again, I'm flirting with the Bears over at 8.5. I'm flirting with Minnesota over at 7.5. But it all depends on how I feel going into the season about the two young rookie stud quarterbacks. Finally, the NFC South. So maybe the most controversial team in the NFL because of what they did in the first round of the draft, the Atlanta Falcons, who chose to bypass, obviously, the defensive edge, Dallas Turner, who ended up going to Minnesota. Another good grab for the Vikings, by the way. They go out and they drop Michael Penix. And after originally on draft night, everybody in the world was going, huh? What? A few smart people in the media, including yours truly, thought about it and said, who gives a rip? You're in the weakest division in the NFL. Kirk Cousins is coming off an Achilles injury. We don't know if he's going to be the same. We don't even know if he's going to be ready for week 1. And while Michael Penix had injury history, Atlanta, according to PFF, had the 8th best offensive line in football last year. We know they have Drake London. We know they have Bijan Robinson. We know they have Kyle Pitts. They brought over Rondale Moore, also from the Arizona Cardinals. We know as well that Zach Robinson, the new offensive coordinator for the Atlanta Falcons, he came from the Sean McVay tree, which is obviously the Kevin O'Connell tree. It's the Zach Taylor tree. It's an offensive coordinator, quarterback friendly tree. And so for that reason, I think Atlanta's going to be good. I think their defense, Calais Campbell, Jesse Bates, they got to get a little bit better pass rush, which they went out and they addressed in the second and third round of this draft. I think Atlanta, we always have a surprise team win the division year to year. Atlanta's probably that team this year in the NFC South, though even though they have a very easy back half of the schedule, I don't think 10 or 11 wins is in the card for them. At 9.5, could they get to 10? Sure, but I have them just below at 9. Tampa at 8-9, so they're over under 7.5. Now, Baker Mayfield had a very good year for Tampa, but we know with Baker Mayfield, historically, he's up and down. They lost Devin White, free agent linebacker, to Philadelphia. We know he got benched at the end of last year's playoff run, but he's a big leader in that clubhouse for Tampa. They used a lot of their money to pay Mike Evans, which I liked. They also paid Antoine Winfield, which, as good as Antoine Winfield is, I'm not sure paying a safety all that money is the right move. Tampa is very good, and I think they benefit from being in that hot sun early in the season to pick up a few W's. They have a lot of weapons. The question for them is going to be, without Dave Canales, who is now the new head coach of the Carolina Panthers, can consistency be the name of the game for Tampa? So I have them at 8-9, right behind Atlanta. Third place, I have the Carolina Panthers. Maybe a surprise to you. Now, their over-unders at 5.5. I got them at 5-11. So again, just under. I think it cannot get worse for the Carolina Panthers than what we saw last year. And they have an offensive coach now in Dave Canales. So again, we saw resurrect Baker Mayfield. And I think, I'm not saying he's going to resurrect Bryce Young, but I think, you got Miles Sanders, you got Chuba Hubbard in the backfield. You got the receiver who they drafted at the end of the first round who reminds you a lot of A.J. Brown. You've got Deontay Johnson, who you traded for from Pittsburgh, a nice number 2. You got Adam Thielen, who was very good as a number 3. You signed Robert Hunt, the offensive lineman from Miami. You paid him a bag to protect Bryce Young. So Carolina, even though they traded away Brian Burns, they didn't get a great deal on that. While defensive line and pass rush is important, they still got Derek Brown. You still got Jeremy Chin in the back end of their secondary. You still got very good pieces, and I think Phil Snow is still there as well as the defensive coordinator. Carolina's defense was not terrible last year. And you upgraded the offense, maybe not significantly, but it's a pretty big upgrade. And I think you can only go up for the Carolina Panthers. And even though they are 5-11, I think this could be a situation where you are slowly building, and potentially in year 3 of Bryce Young, we see more so than a year 2 Bryce Young, a big pump from the Carolina Panthers. Again, maybe I'm too overly optimistic on this team. Maybe they are going in the basement, and maybe Bryce Young was the worst pick. But I don't think CJ Stroud could have succeeded last year with that Carolina team, which was just a mess. and I'm willing to give Bryce Young the benefit of the doubt in 2024. A team that I'm not willing to give the benefit of the doubt for, and the team who I have finishing coming in last in the NFC South, they're over under 7.5. I don't see a way they get to 8. This is my other best bet. I'm taking the under on the New Orleans Saints, who I don't know the direction of this franchise, right? Michael Thomas hasn't been healthy in years. Chris Olave is a very good wide receiver. Alvin Kamara is a decent back, though he hasn't been the same Alvin Kamara that he's been in years. And I just don't know. Derek Carr looked washed last year. This team, Ryan Ramczyk retired at right tackle. Dennis Allen next to Hugh Jackson is historically the worst coach in the history of the National Football League. The Saints, they just have no identity to me. They've really become the Aints ever since Sean Payton has left, and I'm just pessimistic about them. I don't know what to like. There may be a average in every single unit, if you will. Um, they did draft Spencer Rattler as a backup quarterback, which I think is the most interesting aspect of the team. Like they're like the Washington Wizards to me of the NBA, where it's like they're sort of just there, even though obviously the Wizards had their prime years and the Saints had their prime years with Sean Payton and Drew Brees. That's no longer the case. And this may be the team that next to the Giants, I may be the least interested in watching all of this year. So I'm going to give you now my NFC playoff teams. I have San Francisco winning the West and only the number 1 seed. Philly wins the East. Detroit wins the North, and I have Atlanta winning the South. Out of those 4 teams, Atlanta is a new playoff team. They would replace Tampa. You have Dallas as a wild card team. I have Chicago as a wild card team, who they, to me, are going to replace the Rams in the NFC West. And then you have the likes of Green Bay, Minnesota, Washington, the Rams, all at 9-8, along with Tampa at 8-9, all fighting for that 7th and last wild card spot. Again, I think Atlanta, Chicago are pretty much guaranteed to be 2 new playoff teams. And the question is, can Minnesota, can a Commanders jump Green Bay or jump a Tampa or jump the Rams to get that final spot? I think the Vikings have a great chance, and I think the Commanders may as well. But again, I am looking at a situation where JJ McCarthy, if he works, if Jaden Daniels works, if Caleb Williams works, you could see 2 or 3 rookie quarterbacks in the NFC playoffs. Because if Dallas falls short, could it be a situation where Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, JJ McCarthy all get in the playoffs? Yes. And could there be a situation where, at least in the NFC North, Green Bay goes for a team that some people like as a potential Super Bowl pick to maybe the worst team in the division? Yes, I think that is on the board. So I want to spend some time, now that you've listened to me talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, I want to spend some time recapping my thoughts on the 8 divisions as well as my best bets for over-unders. So here we go. In my opinion, to win the AFC East will be the New York Jets. To win the AFC West would be the Kansas City Chiefs. To win the AFC North, it would be Baltimore. Again, just because of a tiebreaker with Cincinnati, though I'm not ready to definitively give it to Baltimore. To win the AFC South would be Houston. As I mentioned, as long as everybody's healthy, I feel confident in the Jets. I feel confident in Kansas City. I feel confident in Houston. And I feel very confident it may come down to a coin flip between Baltimore and Cincinnati. In the NFC, I think the Eagles have a bounce back year in the East. Until somebody does it, no one's knocking off San Francisco in the West. I still have Detroit being the NFC North champion, though Chicago is right on their heels. I think Atlanta does eventually overtake Tampa to win that NFC South division. So if you wanted to do an 8-team parlay, that could win you a couple $100 with San Francisco, Philly, Detroit, Atlanta, Jets, Kansas City, Baltimore, Houston to win the division, by all means go ahead, though I don't think you got to lock that in until about July when we start hearing stories about training camp. As it currently controls, these are my best bets on over/under win totals heading into the 2024 NFL season. I'm taking the under with Buffalo at 10.5. I think they finished third in the division. I'm taking the over in the AFC West with two teams. The Chargers at 8.5, Denver at 5.5. I don't think there's no way Bo Nix doesn't work out in Denver. I'm taking the under 6.5 with the Giants, who I think will be one of the worst teams in the NFL, competing for the number one pick, as well as the under with the New Orleans Saints at 7.5. I don't know the direction of their franchise. Additionally, I am considering New England under 4.5, Pittsburgh over 7.5, Tennessee under 6.5, Washington over 6.5, Chicago over 6.5, Minnesota over 7.5. A lot of these, again, with the Commanders, Bears, Vikings, Patriots, depend on when their rookie quarterbacks are going to play and how they look come preseason, which is the only thing I'll evaluate in preseason. And with Tennessee, it's are they going to be a tanking team? And with Pittsburgh, it's you can never doubt Mike Tomlin, though that schedule this year, the end of it particularly, is brutal. Like that clip from the Brand Sport podcast? If so, make sure you go down there and hit that subscribe button. While you're down there hitting the subscribe button, make sure to also hit the notification bell so you never miss another upload. And make sure you check out all the other clips from the Brand Sport podcast right here on YouTube.